In the heart of East Africa, deep in Ethiopia, a project began to emerge with an almost inconceivable ambition: to tame the mighty Blue Nile. A nation that had been struggling with extreme poverty and instability for decades decided to take on a challenge that many considered impossible: to build the largest hydroelectric dam on the African continent. The name of this colossus? The Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, GERD, as it would become known throughout the world. From the beginning, it was not just a feat of engineering. It was a declaration of energy independence, a cry for national transformation, a symbol of pride. The dam would be the largest in Africa and one of the largest on the planet. Its reservoir would have a capacity so gigantic that it could cover the entire city of London. The height of the main structure would be twice that of the famous Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco. And most impressive of all, the energy generated would exceed 5,000 megawatts, enough to supply twice what all of Ethiopia had produced up until then. The cost was astronomical: $5 billion. But for the Ethiopian people, the value was incalculable. For decades, half the population had lived without access to electricity. For millions, darkness was not just a metaphor, it was a daily reality. Nights were silent, homes were cold, dreams were extinguished before they could even begin. With the GERD, all that could change. The official announcement of the dam's construction came with a bold promise: Ethiopia would no longer be dependent on foreign energy. Not only that, it would become an exporter of energy to neighboring countries. It was the beginning of a new era, the rebirth of national pride. But nothing would be simple. The dam was not being built on just any river. It was the Blue Nile, one of the most important waterways in the world. A sacred, vital, historic river. The project began with the diversion of the Blue Nile in 2013, a risky, technically complex, and politically explosive maneuver. The world watched in amazement as bulldozers and concrete shields altered the river's ancient course. It was like trying to change destiny with your own hands. Behind the grand numbers, there were faces: engineers, workers, scientists, Ethiopians who left everything to be part of this historic mission. Men and women who worked under the scorching sun, day and night, carrying the weight of a nation on their shoulders. Every cubic meter of concrete poured was not just construction. It was a symbol of resistance, of dreams, of struggle. The Great Renaissance Dam was not just a physical structure. It was a powerful idea, a challenge thrown down to the world. Ethiopia can, Africa can. But the moment the first block was laid, something became clear. The GERD would not just be an engineering marvel, it would also be a battlefield, where technology, politics, history, and hope would clash like titanic forces. What began as a dream soon became a colossal spectacle of engineering. On the banks of the Blue Nile, in a remote region of Ethiopia, a construction site emerged that looked more like a city under construction. This was where the heart of the project was born: a main dam measuring 145 meters high and 1.7 kilometers long. A concrete wall built against the force of one of humanity's most iconic rivers. To contain the fury of the waters, the engineers opted for an imposing solution: roller compacted concrete, a modern, resistant, and fast technique. In total, more than 10 million cubic meters of this material would be used, the equivalent of filling 4,000 Olympic-sized swimming pools with concrete. The logistics were absurd. Every meter had to be poured, smoothed, and compacted with millimeter precision. A brutal dance of machines and workers that could not be stopped. But the main dam was only part of the challenge. To maintain the balance of the reservoir, the engineers built 2 saddle dams, secondary structures that stretched an impressive 4.8 kilometers, each 45 meters high. Together, These retaining walls would ensure that the reservoir reached its maximum capacity, 74 billion cubic meters of water, enough water to fill almost 30 million swimming pools. And then came the power plants. 2 were massive facilities, positioned on opposite banks of the river, designed to operate with a combined capacity of up to 3,700 megawatts. Each housed colossal turbines, imported from various countries and assembled on site like pieces of a gigantic jigsaw puzzle. Every gear, every valve, every weld had to be perfect. One miscalculation could mean total failure. But failure was not an option. Building all this in such an inhospitable environment required more than technology. Every detail had to be adapted to the rugged terrain, the extreme weather conditions, and the realities of a region with limited infrastructure. Roads had to be built from scratch. Transmission lines were erected in record time, and even temporary cities were built to house thousands of workers. The schedule was relentless. Every week, tons of concrete, steel, and equipment arrived on site. Engineers of various nationalities worked side by side with Ethiopian experts in a coordinated symphony of languages, cultures, and disciplines. It was the marriage of technical expertise and urgent need. A race against time and against nature. And most impressive of all of this was being financed almost entirely by Ethiopia itself. Without relying on international banks or foreign powers, the people contributed bonds and donations, driven by a collective sense of mission. Never before had the country seen anything so great. Never before had the African continent dared so much. As the first blocks of the dam rose, something changed on the horizon. The Nile, which had flowed free for millennia, began to bend to human will. The sound of water was being replaced by the roar of machines. And there, stone upon stone, concrete upon concrete, a monster of engineering took shape, and with it, a new Ethiopia began to emerge from the shadows. Taming the Nile was not just a poetic ambition, it was a technical challenge so brutal that for centuries, no one dared to attempt it. The river, merciless in its flow, ran with force through deep and mountainous terrain, carrying sediments, ancient memories, and the fate of millions. But in 2013, GERD engineers did the unthinkable. They diverted the course of the Blue Nile. It was the first engineering coup in a silent war between man and nature. Diverting a river like the Nile is not like moving a road. It requires extreme precision, rigorous geological analysis, and a system of canals and tunnels that can withstand colossal pressures. The original riverbed had to be interrupted by temporary structures called ripraps, mounds of compacted rock that temporarily blocked the flow. Alongside, they dug deep canals and giant tunnels to channel the water around the construction site. It was like opening a new vein in the body of a giant. But the real battleground was underground. Before building any walls, they had to ensure that the soil could withstand the monstrous pressure of billions of liters of water. The foundation of the dam required dense, rocky, impermeable soil. Only then would any engineer's worst nightmare be avoided: seepage and landslides. Weak areas were excavated with surgical precision. In their place, tons of reinforced material were inserted, forming a base solid enough to withstand the weight of a liquid mountain. Efficiency was vital. To achieve this, the team set up mobile concrete plants directly on site. Instead of relying on long transports, the material was prepared on site at a frantic pace, 24 hours a day. Trucks, cranes, conveyors, and silos worked like cogs in a living organism. Every second counted. The work could not stop. The risks were immense. An error in calculating the flow rate, a crack in the foundation, or even a failure in one of the gates could mean the collapse of the entire structure. And this was not just theory. The engineers knew. They were dealing with a river that, if it got out of control, could devastate entire cities in hours. The tension was constant. Monitoring teams worked in shifts to measure pressure, vibration, and flows in real time. Satellites were used to monitor the progress of the work and the behavior of the reservoir. All the while, construction site was guarded as if it were a military installation, because in a way, it was. The GERD had become the largest strategic project in Ethiopia's modern history, an asset as sensitive as any airbase, and at the center of it all were the workers. Thousands of them. Some slept on the construction site. Others returned to their villages with pride in their eyes and dust on their faces. Many had abandoned their careers, their families, even conflict zones, to participate in this historic moment. Each day of work was a battle won against the impossible. As the waters began to accumulate behind the dam, a new sound took over the region. A dense, almost reverent silence. It was the sound of an ancient river being tamed for the first time. The Nile, at last, bowed before human engineering. But this victory, impressive as it was, would awaken even more dangerous forces. Because as Ethiopia advanced, its neighbors began to grow alarmed. And what was coming, no one could contain with concrete and steel alone. As the dam rose silently in the mountains of Ethiopia, another kind of tension was beginning to build, far more volatile than any concrete. It was not measured in cubic meters or megawatts. It was invisible, but explosive. The Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam was not just altering the course of the Blue Nile, it was threatening the delicate political balance of all of northeastern Africa. And at the center of the conflict, two countries were emerging as antagonists, Egypt and Sudan. For Egypt, the Nile is not just a river, it is the very essence of life. About 85% of the country's fresh water comes from the Blue Nile, and nearly 95% of the Egyptian population lives along its banks. For millennia, this water has sustained agriculture, civilization, temples, and the survival of the Egyptian people. Control of the Nile has always been seen as a matter of sovereignty, of national identity. And now, with the GERD, that control seemed to be slipping through Cairo's fingers. The reactions were immediate and intense. The Egyptian government has publicly declared that it would not give up a single drop of water. President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi issued a warning that echoed across the continent. Without the Nile, there is no future for Egypt. Behind the words, there were quiet movements. Egyptian officials considered war scenarios. Military analysts discussed, behind closed doors, the feasibility of an airstrike on the dam, something unthinkable in peacetime. Sudan, for its part, found itself divided. Although it also depends on the Nile, the country could benefit from regulating the flow and access to cheaper energy. But the risks of flooding, population displacement, and political instability made Sudan an ambiguous actor. At times, it aligned itself with Egypt. At others, it sought its own agreements with Ethiopia. Sudanese diplomacy began to walk a fine line, trying to balance vital interests with external pressures. International negotiations intensified. The African Union tried to mediate. The United States, the European Union, and even China were involved. Rounds of talks dragged on for months and failed. Ethiopia insisted that it had the sovereign right to use the Nile's waters to feed its population and develop its economy. Egypt saw the project as an existential threat. In the middle of the impasse, time was running out. With each new rainy season, the GERD reservoir filled up a little more. With each turbine installed, the project moved toward a point of no return. Ethiopia, sovereign in its territory, began to retain significant volumes of water, even without a final agreement with the other countries. The world watched with apprehension. Satellites recorded the progress of the work, Newspapers carried warlike headlines. And meanwhile, the people on the banks of the Nile lived between hope and fear. Hope for progress, fear of conflict. The dam, once a symbol of rebirth, came to be called by some as the spark of a water war. Never since ancient times had the Nile come so close to becoming a fiery frontier. And what was at stake was more than just water. It was the struggle for the future of 3 entire nations. Engineering had conquered the river, but now it would have to face geopolitics. Today, the grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam is already standing, with over 90% of the work completed. The silent and immense reservoir is beginning to take definitive shape on the slopes of the Blue Nile. What was once a project seen by many as utopian is now an almost irreversible reality. But with each cubic meter of water retained, the weight of the consequences, both good and bad, also increases. For Ethiopia, the GERD is the key to a historic transformation. The country, which for decades saw half of its population live without access to electricity, is on the verge of turning on the light of modernity for millions of people. Today, more than 50% of the Ethiopian population still lives in the dark, literally. The energy generated by the dam promises not only to electrify homes and cities, but also to boost industry, open roads, schools, and hospitals. It is the concrete hope of lifting millions out of extreme poverty, which has already fallen from over 50% to 31% in recent years. A remarkable leap. Ethiopia dreams of becoming a model for all of Africa, a country that dared to invest in itself without waiting for international aid, and built the largest hydroelectric plant on the continent with mostly its own resources. For many, the GERD is not just a dam, it is a beacon, a symbol of African sovereignty and resilience. But on the other side of the equation, risks remain. The reservoir must continue to be filled over the next 3 years, a delicate process that requires balancing rainfall, drought, agriculture, and the supply of downstream countries. Negotiations remain tense, with no definitive consensus between Ethiopia, Egypt, and Sudan. Each step of the filling is monitored closely by satellites and with anxiety by millions of people. The future is uncertain. Poor coordination could cause water shortages in Egypt, affect entire crops, and destabilize entire regions already weakened by conflict and climate change. The risk of armed conflict has not completely disappeared. Words are still sharp, speeches charged, but so far, war has been avoided by diplomacy, by time, by hope. The GERD represents an infrastructure that goes far beyond concrete and turbines. It shapes the geography, economy, and diplomacy of an entire region. Its effects spread like waves, first in Ethiopia, then through Sudan, Egypt, and finally throughout Africa. A new chapter is being written in the history of the continent, a chapter that involves cutting-edge engineering, political courage, and decisions that will affect generations. It remains to be seen whether this chapter will be remembered as the starting point of a collective rebirth or as the beginning of a new era of disputes over water, the most precious resource of the 21st century. The answer does not lie only in the walls of the dam. It lies in the hands of those who decide how to use it. If this story impacted you, show that you also believe in the power of overcoming obstacles and engineering that transforms the world. Comment with your honest opinion. Share with those who need to know about this reality. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Here, each story is made to touch your soul. Let's go on this journey together.